What if I told you that a minor tweak to your control scheme could change the way that you game forever? It all starts with this guy right here. L1, the left bumper, or just L if you're on the go. It doesn't really matter what system you're on or which controller you're using. The important thing is the button's position. That said, for the sake of simplicity, I'll be referring to it as L1 for this video. So why am I talking about it? If you're a fan of FromSoft games, whether it be their latest release, their first Souls game, or even Sekiro, you may have heard of the Claw. Some people, myself included, don't like the fact that sprinting prevents you from being able to move the camera. The button for sprinting is typically pressed using the same thumb that operates the camera. There are other games that use the face buttons for sprinting as well. The Claw method introduces the index finger to resolve this issue. However, this can get uncomfortable, especially since you're having to actually hold down the sprint button with this awkwardly bent finger. So what do? This is where the L1 button comes in. If you remap that sprint button over here on circle to L1, you suddenly don't have carpal tunnel anymore. Not only does this allow you to comfortably sprint while still being able to manipulate the camera, it also allows you to move quickly with only one hand. I've been typing this whole script while making my way to Hyrule Castle. You're no longer forced to have both hands on the controller at all times while sprinting, as many of these games require you to tilt the stick and hold the face button down. But using L1 while sprinting, you can scratch your eyebrow, move your hair back, take a sip of your gamer juice, give a firm handshake, write your last will and testament, put on a puppet show for your nephew, or pet your cat. Those who play on PC are likely quite familiar with remapping buttons. On consoles, this practice hasn't really been embraced by most games. Typically, if you're lucky, you'll get a few different preset control schemes you can pick from. Fortunately, the 8th generation of consoles did embrace accessibility options, which for one is great for those who need them in general, but it's also good for remapping controls for convenience. The only caveat for using these accessibility functions is that the button swaps are universal. You're not just changing the sprint button, you're changing every action that particular button does. So for example, when I did this in Dark Souls, I had to get used to exiting menus with the L1 button. After a little time, it sort of became second nature. Obviously, this is going to be less of an issue for playing on PC. Is this change necessary for every single game? No. Not every game has sprinting, and not all sprinting controls are mapped to face buttons. Some games even have it mapped to L1 by default. Good job. And some control schemes just don't lend themselves well to this method, like Rockstar games. Having to mash L1 just doesn't seem like a good time. But another popular placement of the sprint button is L3, especially in first-person games. And this is actually a pretty good standard. It has the benefits of only taking up the use of one hand, plus you don't have to hold the sprint button down. The only awkward part is the sprint dismount, especially if you just want to go from sprinting to jogging. Depending on the game, you may have to stop moving entirely and then start up again. There's also the issue of not necessarily being able to tell if you are in fact sprinting sometimes. This is something I encountered in Horizon. There were times when I would be rapidly clicking the stick, unsure if I was winding up the sprinting animation or if I was still just doing the normal jog. Thankfully, the game allows you to either toggle or hold to sprint, so in this case I actually did change it to L1, but for things like Metal Gear Solid 5, I left it on L3 as it's very easy to tell when you're actually sprinting. But by and large, for most of the games that I play, I will end up remapping that sprint command on Old Faithful, because it's just so practical. And of course, I would encourage you to establish any other universal control inputs that you think would benefit you. For example, I'll often put healing items on the left D-pad. Much like the L1 sprint, it's something I started a long time ago that just kind of stuck, and it's become a good shorthand for whenever I need to heal up. And maybe you can do something similar, so just tinker around with your controls and see what you can come up with. I would definitely recommend the L1 swap though, especially if you're playing Elden Ring, which I just so happen to have made a video about, and it's right there. It's so weird. You could click on it right now even. So, I mean, like, why not?